Hello, hello, beautiful people. Welcome, welcome. We really appreciate your time, love, and attention today. I am Teron Foxworth, and I am head of developer advocacy at Meroxa. And welcome to the first episode of Real Time with Meroxa. This is a new live show where I'll be your host and I'll sit down with experts in the data ecosystem to help you gain just a clearer picture of how to navigate the world of data. Before we hop on to the good stuff, just a little housekeeping. First things first, this is recorded. So if any of you or your coworkers couldn't join, we'll be able to send you a recap after so you can share all the good information. Secondly, we are live so you can ask questions. So we're streaming this right now to both YouTube and Twitter. So if you're on either of those platforms, drop in questions, we'll be able to see those and answer those in real time. And lastly, just to tell you a little bit about Meroxa, if you're unfamiliar, Meroxa is a real-time data platform. We give data teams the tools that they need to build real-time streaming infrastructure in minutes, not months. Really, the goal of our platform is to give you the ability to not have to worry about brokers, connectors, transforms, or any of that stuff, and just focus on the resources in the pipeline. And what you see here shown on your screen is this is our interactive getting started guide. So right from our docs, you can go choose your source, choose your destination, and immediately get some instructions to start doing some real-time data pipeline stuff. So I would love for you to check it out and let me know what you think. But now I would love to introduce my guest today, Ali.
Hi.
Hello.
Yep. Ali Hamidi, CTO and co-founder at Meroxa.
Oh, sweet. So I wanted to just tell the people just a little bit about you. So I'm sorry I got to read your bio while you're on the screen. It might be a little awkward, but it's all good.
All right.
So everyone, this is Ali. In the past, Ali was the lead engineer on the data team at Salesforce, where he worked on the control plane that managed millions of databases for tens of thousands of customers globally. So the information that you're getting today from this person is amazing because he has a ton of experience in this space. And I am happy to work with him at Meroxa as he is our CTO and really thinking about how we're building out the future of this data world. So thank you, Ali, for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, so on to the meat. Internally, we've been talking, you and I and a bunch of us, about where the future of data is going. And just through all the conversations, Meroxa helps company builds data pipelines. And that's kind of where we started. We started at the data pipeline level. And then it became, well, there are other types of, applications that fit this model, but then they're not usual applications. They're applications that operate on data in a very specific way. And we're trying to figure out what this is. So really what this is today is an open conversation of figuring out what is this new world that we're edging into, and how do we start to, classify these things for a couple reasons. One, so A, we can have conversations. B, so we could build best practices around it if it is a thing. And C, then build a community and people and put efforts around the things that matter or the direction that we're going. So to kick us off, Ali, I would love just to hear your framing about okay, from where you see it now and kind of your thoughts, how would you label this idea of a data application?
Yeah, sure. So I think the term data application is kind of a difficult one to describe because really every application is a data application, right? The whole point of an application is either creating data, consuming data, presenting data in some way. But I think for the context of our discussion and really what we're trying to do with Meroxa, I want to narrow the scope significantly. And really, when we talk about data applications, for us, it's really about applications that manipulate data in a particular way, or transport data in a particular way, or help you manage that data. So you and I have spoken about this quite a bit, and tried to come up with a concise way to describe what those sort of common primitive operations are. And I tried to even come up with the three Ps to make it very memorable, like the persist, project, process.
Yeah.
The idea of trying to make it very easy to remember. But I think a strong analogy is that of maybe like cloud computing in general, where you have the idea of storage, compute, and maybe networking. And so storage would be the persist part, where it's all about getting the data and persisting it, maybe replicating it. So a particular use case you might think about there is something like auditing. If you want to provide a durable store of all of the activity that your customers or your users have made on the platform, you want to persist them in a immutable store so you can verify it for compliance. So that would be like the storage aspect. Sort of the transport would be getting the data from one place to the other. This is kind of the core of what we do, right? The pipeline. I have data in Postgres. I want it in Snowflake because I want to do something interesting with it. And then there's the process aspect, which is I want to apply some sort of computation to derive additional value or additional insight out of that data. Maybe it's from combining records, creating a richer augmented record. Maybe it's taking something from a third-party source and kind of injecting in there. Potentially, it's just counting things, right? I have 10 records. What's the average amount spent across those 10 records? So then you're creating some new data out of the existing data, and so that falls into the compute or the process aspect. And so when we talk about data applications, it's usually those types of things, applications that do one or some combination of those sort of primitive operations.
So it's an application that takes data from one place to another to persist it. That's the first P. The second P is maybe take it from one place to another, but do some processing in between.
Sure.
That's the second P. And then you explain to me the last P.
Like the project. It's not a great one. I'll admit I had to reach for another P just to get the three Ps. But the way that I kind of thought about it there is it's presenting that same data in a different configuration or a different format or a different shape. And so imagine the case where I have a pipeline. It's pulling data from my CRM, and maybe I want to make it available to a third-party partner of ours, but I want to hide some of the user-specific or user-identifiable information. Then I'm masking certain fields. Maybe I'm concatenating certain things. And so then it's not really creating any new data, and it's not really processing any number of records. It's just a different view of the same data. So that would be like the projection, or maybe you can think of it as like a transformation, but on a smaller scale, just to kind of change the shape of that data. Again, it's not a great one. Project doesn't immediately mean the same thing to everyone. But yeah.
But I see where you're getting at, right? It's just, okay, here are the pockets of commonalities that we see in like applications that manipulate and operate on data. And I kind of want to dig into that a little bit more. So, what are some use cases? So it's like some real world use cases of some of these things. So you mentioned audit logging, but like, what would you think? What would you say? Oh, this is a data application, but maybe we wouldn't think it of as such, or it is, and we just kind of makes a lot of sense.
I mean, the audit log thing, or say if you're doing maybe disaster recovery or like geographic replication, maybe you have some databases that are distributed in many different places, then that would be a data application where you're taking it from one place and syncing it to the other reliably. Maybe you're doing something more sophisticated like bidirectional syncing, right? You might have a database in Europe because of data locality requirements there, and a database in the US, and you want to do some sort of analysis centrally. Maybe you're tapping into both and kind of excluding some of the data. So that would be kind of the data application, at least based on our narrow definition of it.
And then I think where this particular conversation gets really interesting is when we talk about, so those are data application use cases in the typical data engineering world, but there's also this data application kind of framework in the software engineering world where, the data from one place to another might be a transactional database to a real-time cache, or a transactional database and your search indexing. And once we kind of think of them as such, using these foundations, really now, like I mentioned before, we can start to build tools around okay, how do you best ship data? And then now in context go, well, whether you're doing cache updating or data warehouse ingestion, those are two very different people who will be doing that within an organization. It's kind of really the same thing.
Right.
Um, is there any other model that you've seen something like this?
Mm,
So really, we're
yeah.
kind of like taking the data engineering world and the
Yeah.
software engineering world, and like
Yeah. You
they're
see, yeah,
yeah.
there's similar analogs, throughout time. I think one of the more sort of obvious ones that pops into my mind is the move from having like a DBA managing your database to kind of rolling that functionality into, wrapping it in ORMs and kind of abstracting that. And so you're kind of taking what would have been done by a dedicated DBA, an expert in databases, and kind of bringing it closer to the software engineering. And then similar sort of move towards DevOps, right? Previously, you would have an
Mm,
infrastructure team. They're experts in infrastructure and cloud components and all these other things. And then with the movement towards infrastructure as code, you're kind of taking that and sort of maybe hiding less of the details because if you look at Terraform or Pulumi, you still need to know quite a bit about the underlying infrastructure. But it's a similar move,
mhm.
right? We're taking this expert knowledge required in those areas, and we're kind of rolling it up towards the software engineer, getting it a bit closer to the people who are actually working on those things. So I kind of see that's the move that we're trying to facilitate. Really, is
Mhm.
um, try to bring that data engineering task, that work, a little bit closer to the software engineer. Enable, empower the software engineer to be the ones actually creating these pipelines, making the data that they need available to them, so they can build out these data applications.
Yeah, and I think it's a good thing to note here too is that like even in infrastructure role, you still have your typical DevOps team, but now you have maybe software engineers contributing to like Prisma schema, for example,
Mm,
and now you get like this unique parity of the problem between two domains. What I think is interesting in the data side is that now if given that the tool set does exist right now, like software engineers, they're building the applications that interact with the data systems,
right.
like either upstream or downstream, right? So as they're interacting with these applications, it would make sense for them to use the same level of tooling to ingest and export as the
Yeah.
data engineers themselves, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the software engineers are closest to the data in terms of the source of the data, what's happening with the data. They're also potentially the consumers of the data as well as the creators. So if you have like an application that's creating data, it's going into a database. Maybe you're creating a pipeline to pull it out of that database, do some analytics combination of data, enriching that data source, and then potentially feeding it back into the operational data store so that application can use it again. And you're kind of closing that cycle. And
Mm-hmm.
so it totally makes sense to bring as much of that the data engineering task to the software engineer, because really they're closest to the problem. They're the domain experts in this case. They're the creators and the consumers of the data. So it makes sense for them to be empowered to actually build these things out.
Yeah. So this kind of idea of a data application is bridging the gap between those two worlds.
Yeah.
And this actually bring me up a good thought that I had the other day. It's around like, software engineers in general. Now that data is becoming a very forefront of the application building process, like we used to think, well, here's your app, and then your data now lives inside your app. But
Hmm.
really, the mental model switch is going from that to, well, here's your app, and the data exists in a system that exists next to it.
Right.
And really all it does, it just kind of changes your expectations on how you build. Your applications is interfacing with the data, not
Yeah.
generating it. And then I think we could see this in like the Web3 movement, right? Where the database is the blockchain and your application doesn't do anything to the data, it just interfaces with the database.
Right.
So once we start to like view our applications in that way, like you gain just a lot of benefits. Like
Right.
like data integration. It's now a forefront with thought within like your data architecture.
Yeah.
It's adding new data sources. So now you're kind of, I think we called it like data-centric. So now with this new model of like defining a data application, now we have this data-centric, data-forward building mindset that preemptively solves a lot of problems that you may have.
Yeah.
So so I think we got a good definition of what it is and like
Mhm.
maybe where it's going. Now, what I would love to ask you a little bit about is where's the line? So like,
Okay.
what's not
Yeah. I
a
think
data
again,
application?
again, this is pretty hand wavy, and we're really just beginning to like break into this area and try to define that. And so I'd say, what is not a data application would be whatever you consider like a typical application, a typical web application that is accessing that data in a standard way. Um, so I know this is going to be like an incredibly unsatisfying answer, um, but yeah, basically sort of the typical things that you think of if you're building, um, you know, a Rails application, deploying it on some platform
Hmm.
that then consumes some data from a particular database or produces data into a database. Uh, Based on our very narrow definition, that's not really the data application. But similarly, I think the I would also potentially say things like where you're building a infrastructure component around transporting data. I think that
Hmm.
sort of steers a little bit further away from our definition of a data application, in the sense that it's more plumbing and less application. And I think there it's mainly it's not an application because software engineers aren't building it. It's really more of an infrastructure thing. And I think
Hmm.
that's the line that we're explicitly trying to draw and say, actually, we want software engineers to be the ones building these things rather than like an infrastructure team standing up Kubernetes and Airflow and Kafka and deploying like a JSON configuration and fiddling around with logs and that kind of stuff. I think that's potentially where we draw the line. Technically, they are achieving the same primitives, but it's the path that they're taking that where we essentially want to say, actually, we're more interested in empowering the software engineers to achieve that rather than necessarily um, focus on providing better ways to deploy Kubernetes or Airflow.
Yeah, I mean, and just like you said, they're the applications that are typically generating, manipulating,
Yeah.
taking in and out, interfacing. It makes sense to bring them close to the process.
Yeah.
Um, so on that note,
Yeah.
we get to now the kind of the next question is, okay, here I am. Now you're telling me as a software engineer, I should like contribute to the data world or
Yeah.
begin to like think about some of the data applications that I may have in my architecture stack and
Yeah.
looking at them as such. What, as a software engineer, do I typically need to know? Because to use your analogy, if I'm using Terraform, I kind of got to know about AWS,
Right.
GCP, or Azure
Yeah.
to some degree, right? To be able to generate the Terraform. Like it
Yeah.
definitely gives me more tools, but there's
Yeah.
still some learning involved. So
Yeah.
for if I'm a software engineer now building a data app, so like migration or this cache update, what should I know?
Yeah. I think, unfortunately, I mean, this is one of the reasons why we created Meroxa in the first place is really to address this case. I think right now, if you look at a typical data stack, and there are quite a few blog posts about the modern data stack and similar things like that, it's usually a pretty sprawling landscape of different tools, and so you are looking at things like you know Kubernetes and Airflow and Kafka, and then various types of databases, data warehouses, different stream processing tools, maybe Spark streaming. There's like an endless list of all these different things. And so, realistically speaking, if that's what you want to build right now, you kind of need to go pretty deep on those
Right.
in order to get to the point where you, as an individual, can say, okay, I'm going to build um, a data application based on a narrow scope that is going to do something useful, like take data from Postgres, process it in some particular way, maybe hit a third-party API, augment that data, do some additional transformation, import it into Snowflake. Um,
Mhm.
it seems like a pretty simple task, but it still requires a ton of different moving parts. And I think that's the unfortunate state of the world. But beyond that, as a software engineer or as someone who's building this application, you need to have in-depth knowledge of what the data is that you're trying to get, right?
Mm.
What that schema looks like, what those data structures look like, what the records look like. You also need to have access to those resources. So maybe as a software engineer that's building my application, I don't necessarily have access to direct DB access. Maybe that's handled by an
Right.
infrastructure team or something else. And then if I create this thing, maybe I create this stream processing application, then I need to deploy it somewhere. And so again, that's
Yeah.
typically another team, right? I'm going to reach out to the infrastructure team and say, I have this stream processing application. It accesses this particular database. Maybe I need Kafka as well because that's where I'm writing to. And so you're coordinating across multiple teams with various technologies just to get to the point where you can deploy this thing.
Right. Right. And then Yes.
Yeah,
that's
it's a lot.
that's
I mean, that's
that's one
really
of the
that's
comments. It's like just yes.
yeah, that's really the opportunity that we're trying to go for, right? When we decided to start Meroxa, that was the pain point that we're trying to address is
Hmm.
this sort of sprawling landscape of, well, there's so much that I have to do in order to get to the point where I can deploy this thing that just achieves this what seems like a relatively common, relatively simple task. I just want to get data from one place to the other in a particular format. How do I go about that now? It requires lots of expert knowledge. It requires access
Hmm.
to a bunch of things. It requires a fair bit of infrastructure, and so that's really where we're trying to step in and say, well, actually, let us make that easier. Let us handle a lot of the heavy lifting there.
Ali, you're really helping me with my outline today. So like I always want to then ask. Now the next obvious question is, okay, I understand. So we've defined this data application, right? It's something that either persists data, it's something that processes it in some way, computes it, or it might project it to another place, like on a dashboard
Yeah,
or in another location. And now we kind of talked about what it's not. So maybe like
mhm.
the Jamstack, right? Like the
Yeah,
Jamstack application
yeah,
maybe wouldn't be considered a data app because it's not really interfacing, doing the three things that we defined. And then so like today, there's these tools that exist, but I kind of got to know about infrastructure, data, and the data itself. So coming back to just rooted in, all right, where do I start? So how do I begin to now identify in my stack that, oh, this is a data application and maybe we should treat it as such? Like,
yeah,
or if I wanted to now participate in this world, where do I begin?
yeah. I think a solid starting point would be just sort of list the locations of data and like enumerate where you have this particular data. Most common or most companies now, most businesses will have a number of data sources, multiple databases, maybe caches, additional systems. Like maybe you have some data sitting in Zendesk, maybe you have some stuff sitting in a CRM. So kind of locate and enumerate all these pockets of data, and then sort of dig deeper into those and look at what data is actually available in each one, what that schema looks like, where the valuable bits are. That's like a solid starting point. Just having that, I think, is a pretty good first step.
Mm-hmm.
And then becomes the task of, all right, well, I know where the data is, I know what it looks like, I know which parts of it that I want. And so now the ask is, how do I get it out into a format that I can actually use, right?
Right.
And so I think that's when you have the choice. You either go deep into like the modern data stack experience and you start developing that expertise in things like Airflow and Spark and Kafka Connect and all these other tools, or you could go somewhere like Meroxa, for example, and just create an account and try that instead.
Yeah.
And so that's the exact reason why we created Meroxa is to address that use case, and really kind of shrink down the pool of expertise required and make it so that most people, software engineers, people who are, we use the term data aware software
Yeah.
engineers. Yeah, people who want to access this data, who want to interact with this data, but aren't necessarily data engineers or experts in these data engineering products or tools, make the data available and allow them to create these pipelines where they can, carry out these primitive operations.
Mm-hmm. I have a question for you. That's not going to show up on the screen, unfortunately.
Okay.
Um, so so as you were talking about just how to get started, a question came to my mind. Well, when I'm as a, now a software organization is going, all right, we need to start thinking about our data.
Hmm.
There's two ways you can kind of approach that problem. You can first go, okay, well, what questions do we want to answer? And then go figure out the data to answer those questions.
Yeah.
That's way A. And then you also have way B, where you can just do what you said and just list out all your data sources, try to
Yeah.
get them into a warehouse, and then just figure out what answers can you answer. And
What
then
questions? Yeah. Yeah. What questions can we
what
answer
questions
based on
can
the
you
data we
answer?
have?
Sorry.
Yeah.
And then there's some like combination of both.
Yeah.
Where do you fall on that spectrum on like where should someone start? Like what should they do? Do they do A or B or a little bit of
Yeah.
both, or how does that work?
I mean, as I think, well, it depends, right?
Mm-hmm.
if
Yeah.
you if the question you're trying to answer is very obvious, like if your product organization or your marketing or sales organization says we need this data in order to, close more deals or increase our margins or whatever it is, then the question is obvious. But I still think it's worthwhile going through the exercise of just sort of cataloging all of your data and
Hmm.
deciding, this is what we have, because I think there's a ton of value sort of captured in that data that maybe isn't really being leveraged. And I think it's relatively low hanging fruit just to do that exercise.
Yeah.
And maybe that will sort of inspire some additional questions where it's like, oh, actually, we're also tracking this data. And if I combine this with this other source, now I have some additional insight, which I wasn't really aware of. Because creating, trying to work back from the question, I think is great if you already have the question. But in those cases, maybe you don't have the data that you need. Maybe you aren't
Hmm.
capturing that particular thing, then requires some additional tooling, some implementation work, some engineering work to say, okay, well, our application doesn't capture this thing, which we need in order to answer this question. Um,
Right.
so
No, that makes perfect sense. I especially like the bit about just going through the exercise is kind of helpful,
yeah,
just in
yeah,
general. Like, what data do we even have?
right,
And then here's my last question for you. And this one kind of, let's complete the arc.
yeah,
Tell me about the future. So, and you mentioned this, is that this is kind of the goal of why, Meroxa exists. So now I'm a software engineer, and your future, the future that all the tools work perfectly and nothing ever breaks.
yeah.
What does that world look like?
Yeah, so this is obviously something that we spend a lot of time thinking about. Like
Hmm.
I personally spent a lot of time thinking about, and really the goal for us and for Meroxa as a whole is to shrink that gap, like reduce the gap between the data engineering sort of tasks and workflow, and really bring that functionality and that capability to software engineers. And so that someone who's building an application, a typical web application, doesn't need to create a ticket with the data engineering infrastructure team so that they can go and spin for a week and then come back with something that hopefully is what they need, and maybe it is and maybe it isn't, or it's pretty close, and kind of go through this loop. I think really the goal for us is, can we deliver an experience that very closely matches the typical software developer workflow.
Hmm.
And so again, we're at the very early stages for Meroxa, and really right now we're kind of building the foundation, which is much more focused on the ingest. Get the data to the platform, and then that's our launching point for doing more interesting things. But I
Hmm.
can definitely imagine a world where the process for building a data application will very closely match the typical software engineering workflow. So maybe you create a project locally, you type up some code in whatever your favorite language is, using your favorite IDE, and in there you describe the primitive operations that you want to do with this data. Like take the
Hmm.
data from my Postgres, um, you know, filter out some of the fields, maybe augment that data with, I don't know, some weather API or something, and then dump that data into my data warehouse, and also expose it in some other way because I have some other real-time usage. And then ship that to the Meroxa platform. The Meroxa platform looks through it, figures out how to create that topology, how to
Magically.
deliver those. Yeah, automatically figure out like what you want there, and then it creates these things for you.
Hmm.
But along the way, there are typical things that software engineers, I want to say, take for granted, but maybe not all of them take for granted. But it's sort of practices that have been built up over decades of software engineering. Things like
Right, right.
CI/CD, testing, all these sort of practices that make software development sane and repeatable and sort of reliable. Now, we want to apply those same sort of processes. So the idea of I'm writing a function, I'm writing a transform. I want to be able to run it against sample data and see the before and after and make sure that it matches what I
Hmm.
expect. I want to create assertions around that. So this function should never, like that. If I run this function on a record, no resulting record should ever have the field email, for example, because I'm explicitly masking that out. I want to
Right.
write an assertion around that. I want my CI/CD to test that against real sample data and say, okay, this assertion is still valid. Um, I want to be able to deploy it onto some managed platform that scales these functions for
Right.
me. Um, I want to be able to do all these things that I normally expect with software engineering and software tools, but I also want to apply it to the data engineering space. And I think that's really where we're trying to go.
Right.
That's the vision for Moxa is to achieve that, get that parity with software engineering and data engineering, so that data engineering for software engineers.
Yeah, I mean, and this, to hammer down your point earlier around like, Terraform and DevOps world or Prisma and the database world, those are powerful enablers. So if we could get an equivalent in the data world, that's super awesome. I love it.
Yeah, 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 for sure. Like, allowing, if you look at sort of data engineering expertise as a discipline, or the number of people in the world that are experts in data engineering, it's really a very, very small, like, fraction of a fraction of the total pool of software engineers in general. And so if we can empower software engineers, the people who are actually building these applications that create and consume this data, if we can empower them to, help themselves get access to the data that they want in the format that they want, then that's a massive enabler for us. That's like a magnitude change in the way people create sort of data applications, I guess.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ali. Okay, now I would love to turn to the audience. Are there any questions for Ali? If not, we will just like wait here for a couple seconds, dancing. But no, Ali, I really enjoy, this discussion, because I think when we form these definitions, because all of thanks, Owen, because all of like the things that we do is very well defined. I think that's how we start to build like new ideas and build from there, and new styles. Thanks for the love, Owen. Really appreciate it. Well, all right, Ali, thank you so much. I
Thank
loved
you.
having and chatting with you today. And to you all, this was the first episode of Real Time with Meroxa. Thank you so much for joining us today. And next month, we'll be back with an episode from one of Meroxa's senior front end engineers. Their name is Jesse, and it's going to be an awesome conversation around D3 data and Ember and data visualization overall. You don't want to miss it. However, I really appreciate you. Until next time, have a beautiful day.